Welcome, my fellow seekers. Welcome, my sisters. Welcome, my brothers. It is such a pleasure to speak with you. I am Robert, your humble messenger. It is my privilege to read for you conscious channeling of LL Research. The question tonight is, Ra says, know yourself, accept yourself, become the creator. We would like to know what is the difference between knowing yourself on the one hand and accepting yourself on the other. Could you define these? Is there any significance in the placement of self-knowledge before self-acceptance in this statement? We are those known to you as the principle of QO. Greetings in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator, in whose service we come to you this day. What a privilege it is to be invited to join your circle of seeking and to share in your meditation. We thank you for calling us to be with you. As always, we are astounded at the beauty of your vibrations and at your love for each other as you sit in the circle, blending your auras harmoniously and affectionately, creating that sacred space, that temple into which our voice may come. And we celebrate the extended family that sits in the circle of those who listen by webcast or broadcast, and thank each of you also for lending your vibrations to this beautiful temple and creating this sacred space. We are most happy to speak to the query concerning knowing and accepting the self which is before us this evening. But first, as always, we would ask that each use discrimination as our thoughts pass by your ears. Take those which interest you and resonate to you, and leave the rest behind, knowing that it is only the path of resonance which is your true path. It is not necessary to consider every thought as equal, for the spiritual walk is very subjective, and what is helpful for one person may be a stumbling block for another. Therefore, please guard the gateway to your own temple of perception. We thank you for this, as it will enable us to feel free to share our thoughts without infringing upon your free will or disturbing your spiritual evolution. You ask this day what it is to know the self and what it is to accept the self, how the two are the same or similar, and how they are different. One way in which they are different is that one precedes the other. One must know oneself before one can fully accept oneself. It is not an authentic concept to accept the self in the absence of knowing. It is an empty acceptance. Consequently, knowing the self does precede the process of accepting the self. So we shall talk about knowing the self first. Recently, this group to whom I'm speaking now held its annual gathering, which they call a homecoming. In this particular homecoming, the theme was, who am I? The entire weekend was spent attempting to approach that question. Those preparing to facilitate this weekend had taken care to offer people ways to approach the question that had some structure. And so the group together looked at the self as a sexual being, as a being who wished to survive, also as a being who had personal relationships, and as part of groups such as the family, the birth family, the work family, and so forth. Then it looked at what it was to be within the open heart, and how identity was bound together with the ability to communicate clearly and compassionately. And lastly, the self was looked at as a magical creature who was capable of doing work in consciousness. These ways of looking at the self are all helpful in pursuing the self and discovering more of the underlying structure of one's identity. And yet, as our words must, these considerations fell far short of opening up to the seeker the essence of identity. It is a seemingly simple question to ask. Who am I? And yet it is endlessly subtle. For to know the self is to know not simply things about the self, but to know that which holds all of those parts of the self together. Eventually the question of, who am I, leads into that spacious and integrated sense of being that reflects one of the names of the Creator chosen by those of the Old Testament times to describe their deity. I am that I am. Part of knowing the self is becoming cognizant of and responsible for one's past, for one expresses oneself throughout an incarnation, from the very beginning of an entity's life in third density, as soon as speech is achieved and communication with others begins. Each interaction discloses the self to the self, and the seeker learns about oneself throughout each interaction. Seekers will find that they have certain characteristics of personality, which are persistent and unique to them. And that information is good to know. The seeker will deal with these characteristics of the personality throughout the incarnation, and it is well to be aware of those quirks. Yet that is just the beginning of learning to know the self. For the personality is as a sketch, it is unfinished. It is in living out the day by day and garnering that harvest of daily interactions and responses that the seeker begins to know oneself better. We would distinguish between observing the self and judging the self. For getting to know the self is not a matter of amending the self in order to fulfill a set of guidelines that has been handed down from some source exterior to the self. Rather, getting to know the self is a series of spontaneous realizations As one looks back upon an interaction that has occurred and realizes that the action that may have seemingly been carelessly chosen was, in actuality, inevitable. For there are inhering characteristics within each entity's identity that sound the theme of the incarnation again and again. It is as though your incarnation were a film or an opera, and in the soundtrack, the leitmotif, or the music, would play again and again throughout the incarnation, when the thematic repetition of the pattern would occur. That's not our theme song. This instrument was speaking earlier about her inability to grasp how various entities offered so many kind thoughts to her. And yet this is to be expected, since this entity's leitmotif throughout decades of work with those who come to the organization that is known as LL Research for help have been consistent. There is no grand plan that would support this entity helping others, but only a heart full of love and the intention to support and encourage those about her. If this is done at random, it does not sound that leitmotif, that thematic melody in the incarnation. Yet if it is done again and again and again in a constant fashion, then the metaphysical energy of that consistency sets up a pattern. Love is reflected in love. And so this instrument now has the catalyst of learning how to accept the love offerings of others. Indeed, to know the self is to begin to become aware of the essence of self that trembles on the brink of manifestation. It is to know that which is the great motivator of the self. It is to grasp, to some extent, that sense of the right use of the incarnation, the right way or ways of offering the self in service to others. Underneath the manifestation of the gifts and the lessons learned, there is that underlying and rather vast area or precinct of the self that is beyond expression, yet which is the foundation for all that is manifest within a seeker's lifetime. It is easy for us to say to you that all is one and that you are everything and every emotion. It is more difficult to grasp the unitary nature of your being and the being of those around you. The one known as Jesus addressed this unitary nature of all that is when he thanked those who were following him for feeding him and clothing him and giving him supper. And his disciples said to him, "Lord, we don't remember feeding you or clothing you or giving you supper." And Jesus replied, even as you feed and clothe and give aid to the least of these my brethren, so you do unto me. The question of who am I extends beyond the precincts of selfhood and into that impersonal portion of the self in which the servant is the master and the master is the servant, in which the giver of love is the receiver of love, and the receiver of love is the giver of love. As the seeker grows to know oneself better and presses its search, it begins to learn a great many things which seem paradoxical. For the seeker of identity finds that the self is both loving and unloving, both sympathetic and willing to offer consolation, and unsympathetic and willing only to judge. All of these awarenesses of self then can begin to be recognized for the heartful and appropriate paradoxes that are a part of being a human being in third density, of being both sides of the dynamics. When the seeker begins more fully to grasp the contradictory and paradoxical nature of one's identity, one then begins to see the way ahead in terms of the business of the incarnation in third density, which is to choose between those paradoxes and dynamics and opposites, so that out of the welter of all that there is, and within the limitations of the quirks of personality and the cluster of gifts given, one begins to describe to oneself the precise dance that one wishes to dance in these few and precious days of human incarnation. One begins to see which song one wishes to sing with that little breath that is given one in one's lifetime. And one begins to treasure one's time and one's opportunity to make choices and to express the deepest and the highest of one's ideals, one's dreams, one's hopes, and one's intentions. As one becomes more and more the master of who one is, one may then choose the manner of one's living and one's expression. And it is in this wise that the seeker comes to know oneself. Certainly no seeker can exhaust the material of the incarnation and conclude that one is now in full possession of the knowledge of who one is. For beingness is a fountain that bubbles up from the depth of each being's heart endlessly. Yet each bubbling fountain of selfhood shall have a unique flavor. Each entity shall sing his or her own song and dance one's own dance. As each seeker goes deeper, one will find the images and the themes of the archetypical mind beginning to have more substance within one's awareness of who one is. One may begin to identify oneself with beauty or truth or power or love, as one sees within the living myth of one's own growing legend the shape of underlying archetype. And these considerations, too, aid in knowing the self. This quest shall always be a work in progress. Let us gaze now at what it is to accept the self. Accepting the self recapitulates the journey from head to heart, from manifestation to essence, which knowing the self offers. It is easy to accept the self intellectually. There are hundreds of cliches about the business of accepting the self. One person can only do so much. I'm doing the best that I can. I gave it my best shot. Anybody would have done the same thing. With such commonplaces, the mind rationalizes the self to the self, and yet there is no satisfaction in such exercise. An entity may see the imperfections of the self and invoke an outer presence that comes from above to forgive. And there is an appropriateness to this construct, for the developing seeker has need for ways to ameliorate the effects of his awareness of falling short of his ideals and of making errors, which one would take back if one could, but which one cannot take back. In the song before this meditation began, the one known as Arlo was musing that footsteps on the water take him back to who he is. So it is for this instrument, for in the figure of the one known as Jesus the Christ, walking upon the water and calming the storm, lies that outstretched hand which the seeker may take to bring him up out of the depths of his shame, his guilt, and his confusion. Yet accepting the self goes beyond describing oneself as a wretch, as does the old hymn, Amazing Grace. It is almost, in this song, as if Grace were the Lone Ranger that comes riding into town and saves the wretch from whatever peccadillos or villains the western desert has brought forth to threaten or to condemn. There is in accepting the self the necessity to move beyond the need for others' acceptance of you, and likewise to move beyond the need to beg acceptance of a higher power. For if one depends forever upon a higher power to be acceptable, or to achieve acceptance or goodness as a spirit, then one can never become the creator, but shall always remain a beggar at the Lord's table. and many are content so to be. Yet the intent of the instruction to accept the self has to do with allowing the redemptive power, such as a figure as Jesus the Christ, to become internalized. It is to acknowledge the oneness between the imperfect self and the perfected self. It is to accept the power of one's ability to judge. It is to accept one's essence as magical and creative. If all of the world accepts you, yet you reject yourself as unworthy, you shall be unworthy. You shall not be acceptable. So, the work of accepting the self is the work of gathering those awarenesses of self into full awareness and consciousness, and then finding within that self the upwelling creatorship, which is able to forgive the self for being its imperfect self. Accepting the self is a matter of becoming a judge that is not condemnatory but compassionate. We do not argue in any way that each entity has many self-perceived imperfections. However, the nature of acceptance of the self is such that to accept the self is to forgive and to redeem the self. And how shall that be done? It begins with the bare idea of the possibility of forgiveness, with an upwelling of faith that forgiveness is possible. A seeker may begin to have compassion upon oneself. One's interest is not in making excuses for oneself or rationalizing things done amiss or things not done which ought to have been done, in the seeker's opinion. Rather, it is in the growing willingness to go after the lost sheep of imperfection and imperfect actions, and to carry them back into the heart to be loved, respected, honored, and forgiven. It is the work of considerable spiritual maturity to accept the self. Even if every external action in a seeker's life is perfect, in the seeker's own opinion, yet still the seeker knows one's secret thoughts. One is aware of the mean and petty emotions that chum, unspoken and unrevealed to the world, within one's heart. To accept the self, then, the seeker faces these very imperfections and, with willingness to flow into them, one moves into the energy body to the point where those energies dwell in the shadows of red ray, of orange ray, and or of yellow ray, in lust or greed, or the desire to persuade, manipulate, or control. And one goes after that part of oneself that covets, that part of oneself that wishes to do murder, that part of oneself that wishes to take that which one wants, even though it is not his or hers. One brings it back as the lost sheep, carrying it tenderly, returning it to the whole system of one's being, bringing it into the compassionate heart of hearts wherein lies one's part of the creative principle, your spark of the one. For never mistake that the fire of oneness burns within all, known or unknown. Accepting the self just as knowing the self is an unending exploration. For there is always that which is new. New circumstances spring forth and create new situations in which the self has previously been untried. And each interaction in each situation brings its fruit of self-knowledge and its opportunity for further integration into self-acceptance. The end result of these two processes together is to become the creator. Compassionate, loving, and understanding. This is gained by working upon the self. And once one has forgiven and become compassionate towards the self, then that entity becomes that magical person who is able to love, forgive, and have compassion on others. We are those of QO. My brother, it is so that at any point at which one's heart rises in joy, appreciation, and thankfulness at some beauty or blessing of life, one has accessed consciousness. The steady state of consciousness is one of joy, peace, and love, and it is a wonderful experience when that sunshine bursts through and one's heart is lifted up in the sudden awareness of the stunning beauty of the present moment. We find that the energy of this instrument and of the sitting circle begins to wane, and at this time we would, with great thanks for being asked to be a part of your circle, take our leave of this instrument and this group, leaving each in the love and light, the peace and the power of the one infinite Creator. We are known to you as the principle of QO. Adonai, Adonai.